This is just a simple test recording before the event starts.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Stephanie Malinoff. I'm the program director for the Roadway Safety Institute, which is housed here at the University of Minnesota. We are here for, I believe, our 6th seminar in a series of seminars we've been hosting throughout the fall semester. We have an audience here in the room of a handful of folks, but we also have a handful of folks logging in and watching this remotely through a webinar. So for those of you that are tuned in online, if you wouldn't mind signing in using the chat bubble, which fingers crossed is working this week. We had some technical difficulties last week. The slide on your screen shows you where that chat bubble is in the upper right hand corner of the monitor. If you could sign in with your name, your organization, and the number of people attending and watching from your location, that would be much appreciated on our end. That's also the button you will use throughout the seminar if you have any questions. We will hold questions until the end so that we can monitor those between both the online and audience here in person. If anybody's interested in future seminars, we do have a seminar almost every Thursday afternoon here in this room and streamed live. Kylie, who's in the back of the room, has a list of upcoming seminars. We also have them posted on our website at roadway.umn.edu. There will not be a seminar on November 13th or the Thursday of Thanksgiving. Those are the 2 weeks that we're skipping. But every other Thursday from 3 to 4 Central Time here in this room and streamed live, we have a seminar. Students, I know you've heard this spiel before, but for those of you who have a report that's ready to be picked up, Kylie's back this week. She has copies in the back of the room for you. If you have any questions, certainly feel free to ask her. Max Donath, our program director and the professor for this course, sends his apologies for not being here this week, but he will be back next week, and as I understand it, for all of the remaining Thursdays. So if you have questions, feel free to email him or grab him next week. And I think that's all of the housekeeping comments for now. So let's flip it back to Nicole and help me welcome Nicole Morris. This is actually the second week that I've gotten to introduce Nicole. She was a bit of a guest speaker last week during Frank Dauma's presentation, but Nicole has the full time today, and she's going to be talking about, I can't find it fast enough on my sheet, Computerized Crash Report, Usability and Design Investigation. And Nicole works in the Human First program here at the University of Minnesota and has a project funded through the Roadway Safety Institute. So take it away.
Okay. All right, well, thanks for coming, and good to see you again if you were here last week. So I'm Nicole Morris. I want to mention Alice Tan. She's not here. She's in the building. So that's my sort of right-hand woman on this project. So we've worked really collaboratively on this project since its beginning. So the big thing about a crash report, right? So if you're in a crash and it's above $1,000 or there's injuries involved, you're going to call the police department and they're going to come in and document that crash. So for you as the driver, usually your typical concern is that you're looking for that officer to help you document that information to pass on to your insurance company. So that's probably your biggest exposure that you're going to ever have to the crash report. Now, while insurance companies are certainly important for drivers to make sure we can cover losses of property damage and any injuries, really there's way bigger plans involved with the crash report. So all that data is going to be taken in by the different state agencies, different researchers, and all it's going to be crunched together to really figure out what's the problem with crashes in Minnesota, how does that sort of fare in terms of the rest of the country, and what can we do to potentially prevent them in the future. So a lot of concern goes into that data. Big decisions get made based off of that data, and million-dollar decisions get made off of that data. So it's really important, the data points that go into that report at the scene of the crash or back at the police station. So before I get too much further in, I just want to mention that this project is funded by the Traffic Records Coordinating Committee here in Minnesota. And so that's through Department of Public Safety. And then the project is also sponsored in part by MnDOT helping facilitate that contract with the University of Minnesota. So this is really a project that's revolutionary in terms of a state. So in industry, they do this type of work all the time. So looking at usability and design, this is just par for the course for companies like Google or Motorola or Apple. But when you think about what does a state typically do in terms of usability, nothing like this, to our knowledge, has ever been done at the state level. So it's a really exciting project for Minnesota. So basically what was happening here in Minnesota was that the crash records holding system, so this database that holds all of the crash records, was going to be redesigned. And so since they were redesigning that back-end system, they decided, let's redesign the front-end system as well. So let's redesign the form itself, the report that the officers interact with, so we can improve the quality of the data. Because when we're talking about data, we really have this phrase, which is garbage in, garbage out, right? So if it's not good quality data that's being put into the system, then when we're analyzing it, we're not analyzing anything quality either, right? So you've got to really make sure that when something goes into the system, it's really quality. It really reflects what actually happened at the scene of the crash, right? So when Human First got involved, it was really exciting because it gave us a chance, before a state vendor came in and started rebuilding it, to really start from scratch and design something that was really usable and gave really good, reliable, valid, and quality data, right? So no one really likes to fill out paperwork, and law enforcement officers are nothing unique in that. They don't like to fill out paperwork. They'd rather be doing other things with their job. So we want this to be a really stress-free, painless process, right? So when you think about the usability of a form, typically, let's say you go onto a internet website and you hate the usability of the website, right? What do? Anybody? You leave the site, you go somewhere else, right? But if it's your job to interact with this usability, sort of terrible usability, you're trapped. You don't have any choice. So this is the officer's job. They're forced to interact with this website, and if it's bad, it's just going to lead to a lot of frustration on part of the officers. So even more so, the state has a big responsibility to make sure that this interface is something the officers can really use, because they don't have a choice. They can't just log out and log into some other site that's much more usable, right? So we've really got to make sure that it's designed really well. So what we did was we took human factors principles, what we know about good usability, and redesigned the report. And then we were able to capitalize on all the experience of law enforcement. So they've got a lot of insight, right? They fill out thousands of these reports over their career, and they know sort of the problems, how we could fix it. You just really have to tap into that expertise, right? Okay, so there are really two big phases to this project. So the first is phase one, and this is really just the human factors analysis part. So we did a hierarchical task analysis. I'm going to call that HTA because hierarchical task analysis is a mouthful. So HTA, we did cognitive walkthroughs, interviews, card sorting tests, and surveys. So I'm going to talk about each of those in detail. Okay, so the first is our HTA. Now this is a really time-consuming but important part of human factors when you're really dealing with a complex system, right? You want to really understand what are all the steps that the user has to complete, right? And if the steps are going to change based off of their input, you need to know all of that logic. So if they do this, what happens? If they do that, what happens? Right? And so you have to document each and every step. On top of that, you really need to know what is the system's responsibility and what is the user's responsibility, right? Because really we have this idea that there's knowledge in the world and then there's knowledge for the user, right? Knowledge in the world is always superior to the knowledge of the user, right? So if we can have the system capitalizing on knowledge of the world and inputting that information whenever we know and whenever we can access knowledge in the world, that's going to speed things up and we're going to get more reliable data. Now what I mean by that is there's knowledge in the world about your driver's license, right? So rather than having the user have to input that manually, all the information that they can read off of your driver's license, there's a database that already exists that has that information. So let's have the system tap into that database and just auto-fill in those features. So the reliability improves, right? We're going to get more quality data, and then we're going to take that responsibility off of the user. So those are some things that are already available in the crash report, but we really want to expand upon that, right? How much autofill features can we do to make better quality data within the report and eliminate some of the responsibilities on the user? So this is just a really small slice of a graphical depiction of an HTA. And so you can see, they start the report, and then they have to document who they are, right? They've already logged in, so the system should know what their rank is, what their agency is, all of those things, but the current report makes them fill that out each and every time, right? So it doesn't seem like a lot of steps, but putting in your name, rank, agency, badge number, and if you work for the State Patrol, what is that station number, right? We could have that be knowledge in the world already and have that auto-filled in, and now we've already eliminated 5 steps for that officer, right? So if you can do that again and again and again throughout the report, then we can speed up this process dramatically. Okay, so when we went through the report, we found for a single vehicle crash, right? So this is just one unit, assuming that unit went off the road and hit a tree, something like that. There are about 175 steps in total. And those are certainly going to change depending on, was it a work zone? Was it a commercial motor vehicle? So there's a lot of things that can change the number. But on average, we can expect about 175 different queries that we ask of the officer for just one vehicle, right? So imagine we have a 3-unit crash, right? It's going to just be really large, okay? So we looked at what's the division of responsibilities between the system and the user. We found it was really user heavy, right? So only about 24 things could the system fill out for the officer. So given things that the officer put in, the system could sort of auto-populate that information. And typically that came from things from Department of Motor Vehicles, right? So if they put in the tag number and it was a Minnesota tag, then it can autofill some of those features. If you put in the driver's license, it can autofill some of those features, assuming that it's a Minnesota driver's license. If it's not a Minnesota driver's license, all that has to be done manually, right? So there are definitely some times when they don't even get that benefit of 24 steps, right? All 175 is on the officer, okay? So right away we said, well, this is a big goal of the report, that we really want to reduce the number of steps for the officer and put that onto the system. So shift away as many steps as we can from the officer and make the system really smart. Make it really intelligent that if you say this, then the system knows this, right? You don't need to put in each and every data point. Okay, so the next thing we did with officers is what's called a cognitive walkthrough analysis. So this is really an in-depth style of interview process where you have the user interact with the system that's of interest and have them sort of just walk you through. So talk aloud, think aloud as much as possible, tell you all the things that they're doing, why are they doing it, and you document all of those processes. So it helps us figure out what are they trying to do, right? So if they say, I want to input this information and they show you how to do it, and you know the rule, and you see they think that they're doing something correctly, but they're not really, and you see a lot of commonality across officers, you can say, well, maybe there's a training issue, or maybe there's a validity issue or reliability issue here. So it allowed us to start early on figuring out where are some of the big problems within the crash report. Where are some areas that we're clearly not getting quality data, we're not getting anything that's reliable, right? And then, so we did a lot of these interviews. We sampled 12 officers from seven different police agencies, and they really varied in rank and experience. So just as a couple examples of the things that we found through our interviews and our cognitive walkthroughs, two main parts of the report that seem to be really problematic. So the first is a hit and run or a collision with a parked motor vehicle. So the reason why this gets tricky, a hit and run, sometimes you don't know who the vehicle is or the person is who was in the vehicle that was the hit and run vehicle, right? They hit the car, they took off, right? Well, when the officer's filling that information out and they tell the report, I've got 2 units involved in this crash. And the report says, well, these are all the mandatory fields that you have to fill out about both units. Well, the officer doesn't know all of that information about both units, right? So there's one little place in the report that they can put in there that it's a hit and run vehicle, but if they don't know it's there and they can't find it or they don't remember, then the form keeps asking them, tell me about this vehicle. You can't move on. I won't let you move on until you tell me about this vehicle. Tell me about the driver. Tell me where they were sitting, where they were wearing their seatbelt, right? So as a user, you can imagine if you're getting really frustrated and you just want to get back to work, what are you eventually going to start doing? If the form is asking you for something that you don't know and it won't let you move on until you've told it something, what are you going to do? You're just going to make it up, right? That's what I would do, right? You're really frustrated, you just start punching in numbers until it accepts, and then you move on. Sigh a big sigh of relief. So already we know with things like that, we have issues that the officers, if they can't find that one little field to let the system know this is a hit-and-run vehicle and I just don't know the other information, it's going to keep querying them and force them to divulge that information that they just don't have. Same thing with a parked motor vehicle. Maybe there wasn't a person in that vehicle. The form keeps saying, where were they sitting? Where were they sitting? Like, they weren't sitting anywhere. There wasn't anyone in there, right? But if you don't know exactly how to code it to say it was a parked motor vehicle, then again, you're going to just start putting in sort of funny numbers until it accepts, right? Again, getting back to this idea that we're making million-dollar decisions based off of this data, right? And some of it that's coming in is really quality and really accurate. Some of it's coming in as not. And certainly not to the officer's fault. We never want to blame the user. This is really on the onus of the system. Okay, so a second major big incident is sequence of events. So this is a really important part of the crash report, and it basically lets us see in numbers what happened, right? This happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened, right? And so we have 4 sort of data points to know the car lost control, crossed the center line, struck the vehicle, went into the ditch, and did a rollover, right? And you can see that in numbers, right? And you can start to analyze how often do cars cross the center line? How often do they roll over? So what was happening is you have 4 queries, right? Sequence of events, event number 1, 2, 3, and 4, and most harmful event. Only the first one is required. And when they go in there, they see this drop-down list that has, like, I don't know, 30, 40 options for them, right? So they could potentially scroll through and read all 40. Probably not going to do that. The other thing is they can sort of tab through and start typing numbers. Well, O1 is motor vehicle and transport, and that's all it says, motor vehicle and transport. Well, in most crashes, you're dealing with a motor vehicle and transport, right? So from the officer's standpoint and what they've been trained by their peers, just over years of experience, they've been trained that what happened? Well, it was a motor vehicle and transport, and it got in a crash, and they move on, right? So they get to sequence of events, and they go O1, most harmful event O1, and they move on. The issue with that is O1 really means a collision with a motor vehicle and transport. What would that imply? How many units would you need to have at least to have this unit having a collision with a motor vehicle and transport? 2, right? But O1 is being coded for single unit crashes all the time because they just think they're saying it was a motor vehicle and transport, right? So without the system sort of making it explicit, it is a collision with a motor vehicle and transport. You need at least 2 of them. And then you also have to know what are the rules for something to be a motor vehicle and transport, because it turns out if you're a snowplow and your plow is down, you're a working vehicle and you're not a motor vehicle and transport. So if you have a car hitting a snowplow and the plow is down, it is not a collision with a motor vehicle and transport, right? So there's a lot of rules that go into this. The officer has to be aware of all those rules to make sure that they're putting in the quality data, right? So what happens in our interviews with officers, they end up saying, I don't understand this part of the report. I'm going to put it in the narrative. So they give us really nice novels of information. This is everything that happened, and they type it all out in detail, right? So how many crashes do we have in Minnesota? A lot. Who do you think has time to go through and read through the narrative of all of them and make sure that the data matches the narrative? Nobody, right? Unless it's a fatal crash or some really, particular crash at maybe a school bus or commercial motor vehicle, people are taking notice and reading that narrative. But in most crashes, they're not reading the narrative at the state level, or the researchers are not reading the narrative. They're just looking at the numbers and assuming that the numbers are telling the truth, right? Frequently, they're not. The other thing is non-collision events are way at the bottom of that list. So how often do we get told that they departed their lane, they went off the road, they crossed the center line? Almost never, less than 1%. right? But we know half of all of our rural fatalities are lane departures, right? And so half of all of our rural fatalities are lane departure crashes, and we have less than 1% of non-collision events being coded as such, means that we're not getting information through sequence of events in that way. Okay, so moving on. Another task that we did, we really want to see sort of how can we best group this information together so it's intuitive, right? We want officers to really know and expect that when you ask me this, I'm going to see all this other information grouped together, because that's how I think about a crash. When I sort of conceptualize a crash as an officer, I want to see that information grouped together in a logical and reasonable way. So how do we sort of get to that? Well, one of the tools that we use as human factors psychologists is a task called a card sorting task. So this is really sort of the archaic way when we actually have cards, and sometimes we really do it this way if you don't have a lot of users and you have access to them one-on-one, is you put all these individual items that are a part of the report. Maybe you would do this for a cell phone menu structure, right? Where would you expect to find things together in a menu? You put them all out on cards, and then you ask them, group them together in sort of groupings that make sense to you, right? And so you do that with enough users, you document it, and then you can create these algorithms to say, this is sort of the trend. This is where people expect these things to go. This is the percentage of the time that they sort of expect to see a most harmful event, sequence of events, and was there a fire? Those things should be grouped together, and that's where users expect to see it, because we see that across a lot of users. Well, so we really wanted to sort of buckshot, get a lot of users across the state, and we didn't have a lot of time to do this, legit, true card sorting task with real cards. So instead, we took advantage of online card sorting software. So it works just as well, but allows you to get lots of data from a lot of officers. So this was a really amazing turnout. We had 167 officers across the state participate. We had a really nice range of expertise, and it was 68 law enforcement agencies in total. So we had a lot of different agencies. This wasn't just the voice of one metro agency that was telling us. This was really across the whole state. So I know this is really hard to see, but this is one of the graphical depictions of the algorithm that we apply to this data. So it really shows kind of what's the agreement across users that things should be put together. So if we look on this far side where all these words are, these are the individual cards. And here at 100%, they're all split out individually, right? And as we move across to go towards 0, we can see when they start grouping together. So this is sort of the percentage of people that agree that those things should all go together. So when we get to about 50% or so, we start to see these trends emerge, that these are the major categories where users would expect to see those things to be grouped together. So it allowed us to look at trends across users and say, what's the possible structure? How should we group these things together? And how does that differ from the report currently being grouped together? And so we really can see things about the crash. So things about the crash site, date, location, the weather events, all of those things obviously would go together. And then things about unit type, driver, passenger, and then diagram and narrative being grouped together as well. So we use that information on top of our cognitive walkthroughs. And we really got a lot of good feedback from officers that they really wanted to see this one-to-many structure. So they want to start at the crash, right? So there's one crash, one location, one weather event, all those things, there's just one. So let's start there, right? The existing report leaves that for last, right? So you start with all of the users and the vehicles and everything else, and then you end with the crash. That's how it currently goes in the report. And users said, no, that doesn't make sense to me. I get to the crash site, I want to document where it's at, because I'm going to be leaving, right? I want to do that first. Then I want to document the vehicles involved. Then I want to document everything involved with that first unit first, and then I'll move on to the second unit. So they really wanted that structure to be carried throughout the report. And it wasn't even quite so blunt. They wanted things about the driver to be even proximal or far away, depending on how much it seemed to relate to the vehicle. Right? So we ask officers about the driver, and we'll maybe ask, about safety equipment, or we'll ask about their seatbelt use. But they really feel like that's the type of information about the driver that's similar to the unit. So they want to be asked that first because we're sort of working our way out. And then when you get to information about were they drunk, were they on drugs, what was their emotional condition, that's further away from the unit, so they want to be asked that afterward. Okay? So we really followed that structure and flow to get start at the crash and then move your way back. Okay, so we took all that information. Not only did we have to use that information of all the existing elements in the crash report, but it turns out there's a whole bunch of new elements that the federal government would like us to start collecting on top of that. So we had to take all these elements that were already in there and then integrate even more. So we had to make, what was in there really good, plus integrate all of these new things. Okay. So what we did was we built a mock crash report. So this was a largely functional prototype. It didn't actually document any information. There was no back-end system. It was just the front-end system. And so we wanted to sort of create a research prototype that we could modify all along the way to make it a really good quality interface that officers could work with and we could test. And then we looked at a lot of different variables with them to figure out, how well are we doing, what needs to be changed, and what are the modifications that we should be making along the way. So we're looking at two basic interface styles, a wizard and a form. So I'm going to talk about those now. Okay, so a wizard versus a form. The current state crash report is a form. I'll talk about that second. First, we'll start with the wizard. So you're certainly familiar with a wizard, whether you know it or not. The most common type of wizard that most users interact with is when you're installing a piece of computer software. Right? So you download it, and it'll ask you sort of step by step. You're clicking next, 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 and you're sort of just answering one question at a time. At some point, they want to know, do you agree to the user agreement? That's some 45-page long document. You click yes, even though you didn't read it. You move on, right? So question by question. So that's the typical wizard that most of us interact with. Now, officers really early on were requesting, can we have this be like a wizard? Because a lot of them have a second system that they interact with, which is called their e-charging. So if they're documenting a DUI or a DWI, they have a wizard-based type of system that they're interacting with, and they really like it. They say it's officer-friendly or officer-proof. They feel like it really holds their hand, and they don't have to do a lot of thinking. Right? So there's some big advantages of the wizard, that it really does sort of take the user's hand and walk them through step by step by step. But when you think about a wizard for a crash versus a wizard for a piece of computer software, so how many questions do you typically get asked when you're downloading the latest piece of computer software? 5, maybe 10, right? Remember back to the HDA when I said how many steps there were for one unit crash? 175. And we've added in a lot more because the feds want even more information being pulled out of the crash. So we're talking about maybe 200 individual questions for a one unit crash. That's just one unit, right? And that's about half of the crashes out there. So we're talking most crashes have 2 to 3 units involved, right? So that's a lot of individual screens if we're going step by step, question by question, next, 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 right? So you can imagine there could be some major drawbacks of using a wizard for this type of interface, right? But it is really simple, and there are some really great advantages we'll talk more about in a few minutes. Now the next is the form. So the form allows the officer to see a bigger scale of the crash all at once. So you're being asked lots of questions simultaneously on the screen, so it allows you to sort of conceptualize that crash rather than seeing it through one little aperture, right? When you're looking at a crash through one aperture, so if I'm asking you about the airbags, you may forget, have I asked you about seatbelts yet? Did we just talk about that, or is that coming up next? You don't get a lot of feedback about where you've been or where you're going. Right? With the form, you can see all that at once, and chances are good that you're going to be asked about airbags and seatbelts at the same time. You're going to see that on the screen all at once. But it's certainly going to be a lot busier. There's not a lot of room for detail, right? So if you have question by question on the screen, then we can tell you all the rules. So remember the rule about whether or not a snowplow is a motor vehicle in transport, whether or not the plow is up or down, right? You have room for that type of information on a wizard. You do not have room for that type of information on a form, right? Because we really have to crunch it down to just a couple words under each box, right? So there's certainly differences between the user, right? Maybe if you're a novice, the wizard's going to be really great because it's going to be really explicit and spell that information out for you really well. But if you're an expert and you've logged, 1,000 crashes in your career, you know the rule for what's a motor vehicle in transport, and you are really familiar with the snowplow up or down rule, and you don't need that spelled out for you each time, right? You certainly are not going to want to hit next 200 times, right? So we said, well, let's build them both, right? We'll build them both. We'll make it functional for a 1-unit crash. We'll take it out to officers, and we'll see which one do they like best, right? So that was our original plan. So we used a prototyper software called Just in Mind. And so I know these are really small, but you can kind of see the wizards. We've got lots of boxes that they see in sequence versus the form where you have kind of tabs along the side and along the top. So a lot more information being presented all at once. So when we started with a 1-unit crash, you can see that there's not a huge difference in the number of screens, but you're already seeing a trend come out where we have 37 individual screens for the wizard and 10 individual screens for the form. The other thing is how many questions are being presented at once. So on the wizard, an average of 1.6 questions per screen, and on the form, 13 or so questions per screen. So one's much busier than the other, one's much more simplistic. So we took it out to officers, and we were really hoping that they would tell us, we hate this one, we love this one, and so we toss one out the window, and then we build up the other one, right? Nothing ever works like that in the real world, and it turns out that half of the people said, I love this one, and half of the people I said, I love that one, or they said, they're so great, they're both so great. I'd take either. And so we're like, okay, fine. So we'll build it so it's capable of a 2-unit crash, because we thought by that point we're going to have a lot different number of screens. So you can see here, 2-unit crash, 57 screens for the wizard, 19 screens for the form. Surely they're going to start getting next fatigue, right? And surely they're going to go, the form is the better fit, but we still had officers going, I love the wizard, or I hate the wizard, and it pretty much kept coming down 50-50. So we're like, okay, we'll move on. We'll make it so you can have a commercial motor vehicle, which is really the bane of most officers' existence. They really get stressed when they have to do a commercial motor vehicle crash. Maybe a non-motorist crash, you have a pedestrian. Or you have somebody on a Segway. Imagine documenting that crash, right? So we made it capable of all that stuff. And then we made it capable of a fatal crash. Now, what I want to say about the fatal crash is the existing system only does injury crashes or non-injury crashes, and it doesn't do fatal. You can document that there's a fatality, but FARS, the Fatality Analysis Reporting System through the feds, that's a whole different set of questions, right? So how it currently works is the officer documents all the information about the normal crash, and then if it turns out that there's a fatal, sometime within, I think, 30 days, somebody at this stage is going to tell me that's wrong, but there's a timeline that it becomes a fatal crash, then they have to do a paper version of that crash. They redocument a lot of stuff that they already put into the state crash report, but they do it in paper version, and they give all that fatal information to FARS, right? So we want to incorporate...
So if they know it's a fail right away, do they go directly to that, or do they still have to?
They still have to do both. Yeah, so they still do the state report, and then they get the paper document, and they redocument a lot of that same information on paper and submit that. Yeah, so it's redundancy, right? And not to mention that they have their own reporting system, that they're taking their own records within their own police station, and so, they're documenting that 3 times, right? So it's a lot of redundancies. So we wanted to figure out, how can we capture that information within the report and then only ask the few extra questions that the FARS report asks, the state crash report doesn't ask, and we'll build that in. And then we even build it up for a 3-unit crash. You guys guess what the outcome was? Was there a winner? No. Okay. So some of the things that we talked about, and I know it's like we're really focusing on the research, which is, of course, the most interesting part of this work. But here's some of the features that we worked in to ease decision-making, ease usability for the officer. So one of the things, we talked a lot about rules, and there are a lot of rules associated with a crash report that it's hard to keep track of them all, right? So one of the things that we can do in the new report that the old report doesn't do is we can embed a lot of information, right? Because currently they have to have like a cheat sheet, some sort of a guidebook that they can access and pull out and look up the rule, or call back to the station and ask somebody, what's the rule for this? So we can build all that in, so the cheat sheet's all incorporated, right? They don't have to go to a secondary source. So if we know in our cognitive walkthroughs, in our interviews, that this is an area of the report that has a lot of questions, a lot of confusion, then we can build that in and make sure that they know what the rule is at the time. So we can do that through hyperlinks, or we can do that through information bubbles. One thing I want to point out with the wizard, so this is a screen capture of one of our wizard screens. We ask, is there any public property damage during the crash? So this is a lot of real estate for one question. We certainly have this space to go ahead and spell out for them the government-owned vehicles are not considered public property, right? We know that's a common confusion for officers, that they'll type that in, that a police car was hit or a city truck was hit. We don't need that for this piece of information. We're actually looking for more things like a light post was hit, something like that. So vehicles are not included, and we have the space in the wizard to go ahead and just spell that information out because we have the real estate. In the form, we don't have that type of space, right? So this is a big benefit of the wizard. If we know that there's an important piece of information that officers need to see at all times, then we can just put it right out there. They don't even have to go looking for it. I should mention that we found out that some officers are also considering vehicles private property damage. So we have, is there public or private damage? Officers were taking the time to type in that the red Chevy was hit and damaged in the crash. We already asked them like 100 questions about that red Chevy in another part of the report. We don't need them to take the time to type it in here. We're not looking for vehicle questions. So that's what's really great about really sitting down and getting in depth with officers and figuring out how they report it. So now we're actually going to have to modify this to remind them that not only are government-owned vehicles not considered public property, that privately owned vehicles are not considered private property. That's not the rule for this question. So we can alleviate some steps that officers were taking the time to give us that information, and that's actually not what we need. Okay, so other things that we can do, we can embed in hyperlinks. So I know it's kind of small, but here we ask about location of the crash with respect to the trafficway. So we want to know, was it on or off the trafficway? This is actually a new question coming out of the federal government. So this is something when the new report rolls out, officers are not going to be familiar with this question, one, right? So it's nice that we have the space to spell it out. And then two, reminding them what's considered the trafficway, right? So then they can hover over trafficway, and then they can see the diagram right then and there. So they can get reminded about things like, in the shoulder or the grassy area just off the shoulder, what's trafficway, what's not, right? You can imagine this can get really confusing really quickly, and we want them to be able to do this really fast without much thought. So the thing about the form, so this is a screenshot of the form, we don't typically within the form ask a full sentence question, almost never, right? We typically just put like 1 or 2 words, and they have to know what we mean when we have just 1 or 2 words. So in this case, we have unit type. If we did a hyperlink over that whole thing, that would get really visually busy, and really we could make the whole thing hyperlinks. And then wherever they move the mouse, they're kind of going to be constantly bombarded with things popping out. So instead, we have these information bubbles. In this case, this is talking about snowplows. So whether or not a snowplow is a working vehicle or a motor vehicle in transport. So if the plow has been pulled up and it's heading back, it's now a motor vehicle in transport. If the plow is down, it's a working vehicle, and it totally changes the rules. So we have that built in when they're saying what type of unit it is. If they've got a snowplow involved, then before they make their selection, they can have that little bit of information to guide them in their decision-making process. Some other decision aids that we incorporated. So again, this is a new bit of information, but before I talk about that, so you can see in the top corner there, it says red Audi. So currently in the existing report, it's just Unit 1, Unit 2, Unit 3, Unit 4, Unit 5, on and on and on, right? Typically, you don't have a ton of units involved in the crash. I think the most units that have been documented in the crash in Minnesota was when we had the bridge collapse. So typically, you're not dealing with hundreds of vehicles, but even if you're dealing with, say, 5 vehicles, think about sort of keeping your bearings when you're talking about each individual unit. So if you're talking about Unit 5, can you remember exactly what Unit 5 is? So what we do is when we ask them how many units are involved in the crash, we give them the opportunity to create their own unique title. So this isn't anything for the state. This is only for the user to aid them. So when they're in anything with Unit 1, they constantly have that reminder that they've called it red Audi, and that just helps them keep their bearings and speeds them up so they don't get confused. Right? Okay, so again, this is a new question coming out of the feds, and it's asking about the initial point of contact. So they don't want to know all the damaged areas yet. They want to know what's the one point of contact that got hit first on the vehicle. And why this matters for the feds is they want to know when they're doing recalls for vehicles or something like that, they want to know what got hit first, right? And how much does that matter, the point of contact that got hit first. So the existing report, the current report, is a drop-down menu, and it's just like line by line and numbers. And they have to sort of have a mental model of what's right, left, front, back, center, back, center, all of those things in their head. And so instead, we've created just a quick diagram, right? So they can just look at that diagram, bird's eye view, and click, right? So just one button, and they can say, number 1, that's the area of the vehicle that got hit first, okay? Now, if it's not a car, we can know that because we've already asked them type of vehicle earlier in the report. So this is where we can get really intelligent with this report, is that we've already asked them about the unit. They've already described the unit. So they could have said it was a passenger vehicle. In this case, they've said it's a tractor truck trailer, right? So you can see that it would get much more tricky to know where is 4 on a passenger vehicle versus where is 4 on a tractor trailer. So this is according to what the federal standard is, so we can just populate that image in there for them. So when they get to this section, they can see that it's a tractor trailer, or they can see it's a motorcycle, and it helps them sort of pick that spot with very little difficulty. We also do this for the damaged areas. So in this case, they said it's a school bus. So they can say what areas were damaged in the school bus. So this is where we want to know, not just first point of contact, we want to know each and every part that's damaged. And if it was a rollover crash and pretty much the whole thing got annihilated, hopefully not with a school bus or any car, I suppose, they would just click all areas on the diagram and the whole thing lights up. Right? So everything was damaged, and that all gets sent back into the database. Okay, so back to sequence of events. So we talked about this earlier. I got to tell you, this was a really fun problem to solve for officers because it's so important, and we were getting really having a hard time getting good data out of this part of the crash report. So this is a splice of the wizard. I should say that the diagrams and this sequence of events are carried in both. So all the features that we were creating, we found a way to make them work in both the wizard and the form. So now with the sequence of events, when they ask them what's the first event, they have 3 categories to choose from first. Right? So was it a lane departure or a non-collision type event? Right? Was it a collision with a non-fixed object? That would include a motor vehicle and transport. Or was it a collision with a fixed object? That would be something like a tree. Okay? So they can make that decision first. The other thing is it helps us guide them about lane departure and non-collisions by putting that first. Because chances are if a car crossed the center line and hit another vehicle, then at some point they either crossed the median, crossed the center line, ran off road right, ran off road left. Right? And so it helps the officer know that that's a piece of information we want to know about first. And then get on to the second event and tell us that they hit a motor vehicle and transport. Right? And then tell us that they went into the ditch. And then tell us that they rolled over, they got ejected from the vehicle, or whatever the case may be. right? So we expect that this is really going to improve our ability to collect data about these types of events and then reduce the confusion about the motor vehicle and transport issue with sequence of events. Okay, so I know I've sort of given away a lot of what happened, but ultimately what we did with usability testing was we did really an iterative design and iterative testing process. So typically in science, you design your experiment, you have sort of one condition that everybody in that group is going to experience, and you don't make any changes, right? You want each participant to experience the exact same thing so you get the same type of data coming out. But that's really not the goal of this. The goal of this is to create the best interface design we can. So if we saw a problem in the morning when we're up in Bemidji and we go for lunch, we're making the change already. And when we go back to the police station in Bemidji, the next officer is going to see a different report, a slightly different report. There's no sense in making them continue to test out something that's not working. Right? So pretty much each and every officer saw a slightly different version than the other one. If we saw any changes, we made those along the way. But largely, we had 4 big rounds of testing, 4 sort of types of interfaces that we were testing. So each officer got to interact with both the form and the wizard, and we counterbalanced that, right? So we didn't want them to have any bias in that way. Originally, we thought, well, we would have them document real crashes. Documenting real crashes is like watching a pot boil, right? We go to the police station and we just sit there and wait for a crash to come in, and no one would ever crash. So we saved lives with this report for sure, as no one crashed on our watch. So instead, we just created mock crashes. So, we created a crash scenario, we had the officer read through it, and they inputted all the crash data. They did that with both reports, and so we had them sort of think aloud as much as possible, tell us what they like or hate, and so we can make changes all along the way and figure out where the problems are. So we had really good response. We had 41 different officers participate from 23 agencies. So we tried to not just go within the metro for this. So we were down St. Peter, Mankato, St. Cloud. We were able to hitch a ride on a couple MnDOT planes. So we even flew up to Moorhead. We flew up to Duluth and Bemidji. So, no stone was unturned as far as we went. We really wanted to get as many voices in this as possible, and we're still not finished. So there's a lot of agencies out there that haven't had a voice in this yet, and they'll have an opportunity. So the things that we're looking at: usability, mental workload, duration, how long does it take them to get through, and ultimately, what is their preference? Okay, so preference. I know I already gave this away. It was really largely split. So we never really saw a huge trend that officers were really leaning towards one versus the other. We did see occasionally a slight leaning towards the form when we were dealing with really complex scenarios. So I think one of the crash scenarios we gave officers was a tractor truck trailer, which is a commercial motor vehicle, and a school bus, which is also a commercial motor vehicle, and the driver of the tractor truck trailer was ejected from the vehicle and died at the scene. Okay? So that's a complex scenario, a lot of information that they had to document with that crash. And so thinking about all those screens with the form, it's not a big surprise with the wizard that it was just way too many screens. And they got a little fatigued and were not very pleased with the wizard. But for the more simplistic crashes, when we're dealing with a simple 2-unit crash, pretty good satisfaction with the wizard. So we never saw any significant difference in usability. So we had them doing this a software usability questionnaire. We never saw any significant difference there. Never saw any significant difference in reported mental effort or duration. So we were recording them how long it took to get through. Now this was really tricky because remember we're asking them to talk all throughout. So in the final stage we did give them a crash scenario and we're like, don't talk to us, we're not going to talk to you, just try to get through it as quickly as possible. And we looked at the duration of how long it took to document the crash. Again, we didn't see any difference. Now I will point out that the vendor that's going to be actually building these interfaces for the state said, one thing you have to keep in mind that could change with duration with the wizard is that's a lot of bandwidth and a lot of processing to load up those screens. So if you're talking about 97 screens versus 20 screens, there's going to be considerable lag time. So when they click next, they're likely going to be waiting for a long time. There's going to be a lot of lag in between screens. And so when we launch this thing for real, we may start to see a bigger difference in the duration of the two reports. But ultimately, we just kept coming up with no clear winner. And what was interesting was the users would say pretty much the same thing. They really liked the wizard because it held their hand and it took them through step by step, right? That was pretty clear, pretty consistent type of reasoning why they would like the wizard, right? Or they would say, I really like the form because I feel like I get a better view of the crash, right? So I can see more things at once. There's less uncertainty for me. I really like getting that overall view of the form. So those were the pretty two common things. What was frustrating at times was officers would say, I really like the wizard because it's not like what we have now. And then officers would say, I really like the form because it's pretty similar to what we have now. Right? So you can't really win. But what's fantastic about the state of Minnesota is it's always really forward-thinking. And basically early on we were letting them know, hey, there's a chance that we're not going to see a winner, that we're going to have half of our users really like the form and half of our users really like the wizard. And if there's any way that you can build them both, I would do that, right? And so that's what they're going to do, I think, is that they're going to just build both. And so what's the big advantage to that is then you can have the wizard for your more novice users and say you have to document, 20 crashes, something like that, with the wizard to really demonstrate that you know the rules behind each one of these questions. And once you've demonstrated your proficiency, you can graduate up to the form and then use the form. But if you don't like the form, stick with the wizard. That's fine, right? So it's really going to improve user satisfaction for them to be able to use the interface type that they really like. So what's really fantastic about what we've done was the shift of responsibility. So remember we had early on, there's 175 steps, and the form could only do about 24 of those. So with this is a 2-unit crash. And so when we were looking at about how many screens, fields per screen, and required user entry, so things that the system couldn't do without the user, you can see we have around 150 items that the user has to do that the system cannot help them with. But if they're able to take advantage of all the autofill features, and if certain things happen, so let's say they say it's not in a work zone. Well, there's 5 other questions that currently exist about work zones. In the current report, they say it's not in a work zone. And then the form says, what type of work zone? And the officer has to say, not applicable. And then the form says, were there cops at was there a police car at the work zone? And the officer has to say, not applicable. And they go on and on and on, right? With our new form, of course, if you say it's not in a work zone, they're not going to see any questions about work zone after that, right? We move on, right? If they say no one was injured at the crash site, we're not going to ask them anything about transportation or ambulance services. So all those start to get tallied up in possible system entry that the system itself will say not applicable. And then the user doesn't even have to see any of that. We also integrated in a lot more user features for autofill. So currently we only have autofill features for the driver's license for the driver, right? But if you have a witness at the scene and they have a driver's license, wouldn't it be really nice to swipe their driver's license and have it autofill in their information so you don't have to manually put that in? Or let's say you have some adults in the back seat that are passengers and they all have driver's licenses. You can swipe those too, right? So there's a lot of opportunities potentially if people have driver's licenses on them that the officer doesn't have to do any manual entry about those people, their age, their gender, their name, their address, any of that information, right? So in the end, we found we're able to reduce it down to about a 1-to-1 ratio, which is fantastic. Right, so even though we've added a lot more required fields for the officer as far as what the state and the federal government wants, we're able to drastically reduce it down. And so the officer doesn't have to fill out as much information. The system's really intelligent and can help them along the way. Right? Okay. So where are we going next with this? So we finalized all of our usability of the research prototypes. So we're going to make a few more tweaks and hand that off to the vendor. So The state vendor, which I didn't include it here because I just found out, is a company called Apris, and they're going to be building the new reports. So we're going to be handing that off to them, and then we're going to work collaboratively with them over the next almost a year. So we're going to continue this iterative design alongside them. So they're going to allow us to do user testing, beta testing. So they'll be working with our research team to go through and work out all of the kinks. And then when it's ready, we're going to do the exact same thing that we did before. We're going to take their prototypes, go back out to police officers, our state patrol officers, our sheriff's departments, and have them test this thing out. And then we can try to break it again. So figure out what can it do, what's really frustrating, work out all the kinks. So then when the thing goes live in January 2016, it's going to be a really fantastic product. I'm really excited about it. Okay, so I want to make a couple acknowledgments. Again, thank you to the Minnesota Traffic Records Coordinating Committee, in particular Kathleen Haney, who's at Department of Public Safety, that's been a big champion for this, and Katie Fleming at MnDOT, who's been a big champion for this. We also have the Minnesota Crash Data Users Group. Nathan Drews does a lot of work with that, and so he did a ton of hand-holding with us, figuring out all these new variables that were coming in for the feds, what are the rules for those new requirements, and how can we work those in. And then, last but not least, our Minnesota law enforcement agencies. So these are all the agencies that participated thus far. I know there's a lot of them in there, but a lot of men and women that spent a lot of time with us improving this to make it a really good report. So we're really excited and hoping to add to that list in the next year. Okay.
Great. Well, thank you, Nicole. I think we've got time for just a couple of questions. I see one right here, and Kylie flagged me down if anything comes in. For the remote audience, use that little talk bubble in the upper right-hand corner of your screen to submit a question.
What is the platform that you are using? Is it a PC? Is it an iPad or
a PC?
type? It's a PC. So they will have a keyboard, and they have to enter everything by keyboard.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, so what was really interesting is the assumption of a lot of people at the state were that officers are filling this out on their laptop in the police car. What we found when we were working with officers is, I think out of the, 67 agencies that we talked with, I only observed one of them that did it in their police car. The rest of them take as much notes as they can. They do an information exchange in the vehicle, and then they go back to their police station and they do it in their desktop.
So they're doing a lot of writing, and then they're coming back.
Mm-hmm.
So do they use also do they take any pictures, and is there any speech being captured and being translated to these reports?
They do take pictures. I think that's pretty standard to take pictures at the scene of the crash. There are a few agencies that have Dragon and for their other types of interfaces, and so they will do some speech to text, but that's not something that's built into the state crash report. We didn't do a lot of work with the narrative, so that's one of our recommendations, to build in something like Dragon to allow them to do speech to text.
And my last question is, what is the holy grail for something like this? I mean, in your thinking, that if you have, what is the most natural for an officer then when he goes to the crash? What should he be doing that if he has all of the intelligent systems around him, how should he be doing it?
Mm-hmm.
Now, what you're saying is he's going to take notes, he's going to go back, he types it in, and it's a wizard or a form. By the way, TurboTax can give you the two choices. But what is the
Right.
is the most intuitive way?
Mm-hmm.
So is it that he will have a video and a speech that he will talk to people, everything being captured just like a doctor will do, and then everything is translated later by a translator, or what's your comment?
So there's a couple things. One, I should point out that it's a major safety concern for officers to be at the crash site for any amount of time, right? So it's really important to get that scene cleared as quickly as possible, and the longer that they're sitting there, the bigger target they are to be struck. So in some ways, I would say from a reliability standpoint, a validity standpoint, it would be best for them to document all the information while they're there, while it's really fresh. But in the real world, there's safety concerns that really can't allow that all of the time, right? And there's other stuff, especially if they're dealing with injuries or fatalities. Documenting this crash is the last thing on their mind, and we certainly don't want to tax them in that way. One of the things that we didn't work into to our report, but I believe is going to happen, is that so when I said there's a one-to-one, it's actually going to be a little bit better because I believe that they're going to start being able to use GPS. And so when they get there, they're going to be able to log their GPS location, and it's going to auto-fill in all the location information for them. All right, so that would be really great. That's just basically click a one button, or it pulls up a map, and they can click right into the map and say, this is where we're at, and it's going to auto-fill all that in. And I believe that's coming. Don't hold me to it too much, but I think that's coming. So that would allow them to document a lot of the crash information in one step at the scene of the crash. And then I think they should do an information exchange, right? So document the vehicle types, right? Tag and DL of the drivers. Get that information exchange for the drivers, and then that be held in the system. I think that's also happening, so the system will allow an information exchange where it currently doesn't. And then I think probably off-site is the best for a safety concern. We've talked about sort of, what about a tablet version? Would it be really easy for them to go around and just, as they're walking around, be filling this stuff out? Possibly. I don't think that's going to be taken on anytime super soon. But certainly the Holy Grail is make a system that they can document it in like 10 minutes at the scene of the crash and get out of there. We're not there yet.
Well, thank you, everybody. I want to honor our time. It is 4 o'clock Central. I understand that somebody did submit a question online. Nicole, I didn't catch. Did you put your email address on a slide?
Oh, I don't think that I did.
I will have
nlmorris@umn.edu.
nlmorris@umn.edu. Her contact information is also on our Roadway Safety Institute website if you need to find her. Or always feel free to drop myself or Kylie a note and we can get things moving on too. Lee, I know you had a question. Maybe you could grab Nicole afterwards. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Professor Gary Davis from the University of Minnesota's Department of Civil, Environmental, and Geoengineering will be here next week. And we're going to move from the crash report to crash reconstruction. And he'll be talking a little bit about model criticism and validation in the crash reconstruction process. So we hope to see folks next Thursday. Thank you.